Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. If you feel like you're wasting time and money with your current business software or just want to know what you could be missing, then you'll need to join the millions of others who have switched to Odoo. Odoo is the affordable, all-in-one management software with a library of fully integrated business applications that help you get more done in less time for a fraction of the price. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Odoo, modern management made simple. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. It is our third episode of Veepstakes Week, Veep Week, Weepstakes, I think someone suggested we call it. I don't know about that one. But this is our look at the election year tradition of vetting and speculating and spinning and ultimately landing on a vice presidential nominee. We have laid out the basics of how a VP pick goes down. We've talked about the cruise ship rides that made the Republican establishment fall in love with Sarah Palin. And now we go to maybe the most significant vice presidential pick of all time, or the most consequential, because after an assassination, the person picked as vice president becomes president and has a hugely consequential effect on this country's history. Now, half the audience, I think, as I say that, is probably thinking, oh, Andrew Johnson taking over after Lincoln is killed. And the other half of the audience is thinking, oh, LBJ taking over for JFK. We're actually going to do the second one. It's LBJ. That's who we are talking about here. There is a ton about what LBJ did when he became president that had a huge impact on this country's history. So let's talk about the LBJ pick, which obviously at the time we didn't know was going to be so consequential. But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Listeners who guessed Johnson were correct.
Is the lesson here. Do not pick a vice president named Johnson.
That is definitely advice you want to have going forward. Your odds are very bad if you have a running mate named Johnson.
Oh, God. But it is obviously interesting that the two most notable assassinations in this country's history, we have the vice president come in and be hugely consequential. Mm-hmm. But Veepstakes is about the choice to begin with, and I do think there's a lot to be learned about how LBJ ends up running with JFK. I want to remind us of the kind of taxonomy we laid out in the first episode about the kind of various ways in which you can make this pick. You know, is it about regional balance? Is it about ideological? Is it about temperament? Mm-hmm. What is our sense of what the framework for picking Johnson is as Kennedy is moving through the nominating process?
I mean, all of the above. I mean, when I think about the three, sort of age certainly is a factor, I would say. Johnson's older than Kennedy. Not significantly older, but older. Region definitely plays out. You know, we talked before how the Kennedys are New England, blue blood New England. And Johnson represents Texas. He's a Southerner through and through. And temperament, I would say as well. Sort of John F. Kennedy comes off as being sort of cool and collected, and Johnson has this reputation for being sort of a bulldozer and even a bully in a lot of cases. So you have all of these different factors playing out when you think of the two of them side by side.
It's hard to imagine two more different politicians. I mean, Johnson had been a lifer first in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate. He'd been like this party leader for a long time. He looked a lot older. Kennedy, of course, was one of the youngest people ever to run for president. But Johnson also wore his age. They sounded so different, that thick Boston accent and that thick Texas drawl. And they, as you were saying, Kelly, they represent very different parts of the party. Now, Johnson's interesting because he's like one of maybe two Southern Democrats who you could pick who hadn't been actively campaigning against Black civil rights. But it was a way for Kennedy to try to bring the party together regionally. And this is a party with some pretty severe regional splits. So Johnson is a very strategic pick, and yet they also hate one another. Which feels like part of what we have to talk about.
This is what I find so fascinating, is how during a campaign, there's all this mudslinging, and then when it comes to picking your VP, all of a sudden it's like we let bygones be bygones, and people seem chummy again.
Well, we talked about that a little bit in our Hangers On episode of how if you stick around, you kind of by definition have to just pile up the sort of mean things you say about your opponent. And then if you don't end up being the nominee, what does that say? You know, you're on the record as sort of criticizing them. And a lot of times people bury the hatchet. I wouldn't say the hatchet is fully buried here. And it's worth pointing out, you know, LBJ gets into this relatively late in the game, but goes pretty hard, you know, and especially in behind the scenes, LBJ's supporters are disparaging Kennedy, and both Kennedys. We'll talk about RFK's role in all this too, but you know, disparaging the Kennedys as kind of young and naive, and they're even like spreading rumors about Kennedy's health, and his religion is a huge factor here. So yeah, it's pretty nasty and personal, and it really sets up a kind of tense couple days. We're looking at like July 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th, where all this goes down, but a tense couple days to kind of arrive at this decision to actually offer Johnson the vice presidential nod.
Right. This is a race that's going to be decided at the convention. It's still, you know, in that era before you have widespread primaries. And so on July 12th, both Kennedy and Johnson give their speeches to the delegates. The next day, Kennedy wins the nomination. And then, because we're still in the era where you're picking your running mate at the convention, Kennedy has to decide, I've won the nomination, who am I going to run with? And we'll talk about some of the back and forth, but he ultimately goes to Johnson and asks, like, will you be my running mate? His promposal to Johnson.
Promposal. But he kind of has to really work through his brother, Bobby, for a lot of this. And Bobby Kennedy's role in all of this is, I think, very, you know, sort of legendary and well-known, but I mean, it really seems like really critical to all this. So there's that famous photo of JFK and RFK in silhouette, sort of with their heads bowed, talking to each other in a quiet tones. By all accounts, that is the conversation where JFK is saying, you know, I think I'm going to offer LBJ this position. And Bobby, I think, is like, please don't. Please don't.
Why would you do that?
But, you know, Bobby Kennedy, I think,
Bad idea.
hated Johnson, right? I mean, there was real animus there. Is it personal? Is it political? Is it all of the above? What's going on there?
I think it's kind of funny that people thought once he offered it to Johnson that Johnson would decline. And I think it's funny to sort of say, like, let's just offer it. He's going to say no. And he says yes, like, shit. It's like, we didn't expect that. You know what I mean? So I do think that maybe they thought extending the offer at first might be symbolic and not necessarily like something that he would accept.
And I think as far as the animus goes, I think it was real. Johnson saw Kennedy as an upstart, right? Somebody who hadn't really done the time in order to get the nomination, and saw RFK as even more so, right? The younger brother of Jack Kennedy. What had he ever done? And I think there's just something, even though policy-wise, I think they kind of end up in the same place on a lot of things. And Johnson is going to pass a lot of legislation that Robert Kennedy is going to, would have liked to see passed into law. Their personal animus for one another is so deep. They just do not like one another. And Robert Kennedy tries to dissuade John Kennedy from offering Johnson the vice presidency. And then after Jack Kennedy offers it, Bobby Kennedy is like, could you take it back?
Yeah, well, he tries to dissuade Johnson himself to say no,
actually,
right?
Never
and so,
mind.
I mean, which is kind of amazing. And, you know, there are other candidates sort of floated in this moment. I think a lot of it is related to some of the strategy of, do we need a Southern Democrat? What states will we carry? What states won't we? But I think your point that, like, Johnson was one of the few Southern Democrats who could still feel palatable to Northern liberals, I think ends up ultimately leading to this decision. And specifically, you know, like Texas has a lot of electoral votes.
I was just about
bringing
to say,
Texas into the fold.
This would not be a factor, I think, if Johnson were coming from Alabama, or if he were from, you know, a state that had very few electoral votes. Texas is a cash cow, and that's how people saw it. And if he were coming from California, people would think the same thing. You know, it's I think at this moment is one where you sort of have to put personal beefs aside and think about what is, and I think that's what Kennedy is thinking about, what is going to allow a victory? What is going to get us a win? And if this will get us a win, then I can put it aside in order to do that.
Interested in the forces shaping our world? The Council on Foreign Relations has you covered. For those who like to look ahead, dive into The World Next Week, hosted by Bob McMahon and Carla Ann Robbins.
We were not forecasting anything about Russian domestic upheaval, and yet that has been the story of the week.
These are scorpions going after each other in a bottle.
And for those who want to go beyond the headlines, join Jim Lindsay as he opens up the president's inbox.
What should U.S. policy do?
The approach towards China, it's enough to make me question bipartisanship.
And finally, join me, Gabrielle Sierra, on Why It Matters, as my guests and I bring some of the world's most compelling stories home to you.
Do you feel good about where we're heading with AI?
Maybe we need to invent a new word here, which kind of is a combination of frightened and excited. I'm excited.
So what are you waiting for?
For the world next week, the president's inbox.
And Why It Matters. We'll see you soon.
So there's a day or so of back and forth around all of this. The tensions are really high. It seems like it's around 4 p.m. on the 14th that JFK finally calls Johnson and it's like, listen, don't listen to Bobby. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I know he's, kind of in your ear, but I want to give you this role. But as with all things Kennedy's, there are, of course, conspiracy theories and rumors and all this stuff. So, yes, there's this idea. I think it's a little far-fetched, but there's this idea that they kind of offered it to him expecting that he would say no. I don't think that's really the case. Maybe that was just wishful thinking on the part of RFK. But there's also this pretty wild theory that JFK's secretary has that Johnson had blackmailed JFK into offering him the VP nomination because he had evidence from Hoover about his womanizing. And it's just kind of like, Johnson had a pretty freaking powerful role in the Senate.
Right.
I don't know if you blackmail someone to become a VP, which I think everyone acknowledges is not that powerful of a role. So, I don't know. Do things turn? I mean, once Kennedy makes this choice, how does he feel about it? I mean, RFK never seems to bury the hatchet, right?
Right. RFK and Lyndon Johnson are going to remain enemies to the bitter end. But for Kennedy, I think this thing with Texas is pretty important. For people who don't remember the back and forth of the 1960 election, it's Kennedy versus Nixon, and it's an incredibly tight race. Ultimately, the popular vote is going to be separated by 0.2%. It's a squeaker. And the only reason that the Electoral College isn't a squeaker is because of two very close states, Illinois and Texas. And Texas is going to be the state that makes this a decisive victory in the Electoral College for Kennedy. Obviously, there are all kinds of rumors about how Kennedy won Illinois and Texas. And if you're more conspiratorially minded, then he's extra glad that he had Johnson on the ticket for Johnson to steal Texas in the 1960 election. That is certainly one of the many conspiracies around this election. So they ultimately figure out a partnership, a working relationship that at least functions during the 3 years of Kennedy's presidency. But again, LBJ and RFK are never going to be buds.
Our researcher, Jacob, who lives in Boston and thinks, I think, through this lens, but pointed out that JFK and LBJ kind of gives off Tom Brady, Bill Belichick vibes or whatever. It does feel like it's just kind of like, we're successful, but we really are oil and water a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of, and then I think obviously after the JFK assassination, the RFK LBJ rift just sort of really opens up, and they never,
right.
I mean, I think to this day, those camps just kind of cannot reconcile. There's been books written about basically how much they hate each other in that feud.
Johnson creates a law that basically says you can't have a family member or your brother serve in a cabinet position. I mean, there's nothing more direct about how he wanted to block.
If your initials are these, But yeah, it is like remarkable. But, all of this, to take a step back, right? We're here to talk about the picking process. Obviously, at that point, they do not know how consequential that process will be. And, Robert Caro has told us, has written a lot about how consequential this ends up being and how much LBJ really is kind of in a position to really change this country's history in the same way that the other Johnson is after the Lincoln assassination. And so just to come back to some of those basic principles about whether this matters or whether this doesn't, and this idea that like our first rule was kind of it doesn't matter until it matters, right? Which is the case in a lot of politics and a lot of life.
I think the other thing I think about with this, especially with the two Johnsons who become president through assassination, is there are few presidents who were more consequential to the state of democracy in the United States. Johnson for putting the brakes on Reconstruction while he was president, and Andrew Johnson for putting the brakes on Reconstruction, and Lyndon Johnson for shepherding through the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act when he was president. And to think about the power that someone can inherit through the vice presidency is another reason to spend some time not just ruminating on the top of the ticket, but on who's filling that second slot as well.
Yeah, to do evil or to do good. It's one of those things that's baffling.
And so as we sit here in 2024 and we have an election where there is still one vice president at the time of this taping, one vice presidential slot that hasn't been determined yet, you look at some of the names being floated and maybe it's worth thinking about those in light of what Nikki just laid out. But, when you look at the Tim Scotts and the Tulsi Gabbards and the Kristi Noems and J.D. Vances and Nikki Haley's of the world, and then some of the more outlandish names like Michael Flynn or Vivek Ramaswamy or whatever. Like, those people, it doesn't matter until it matters.
Right.
The one thing I think about is just knowing the way that Trump's mind works. And I think it's like classic, don't overthink it with Donald Trump. He just wants someone who looks good on TV. That's the only thing he'll care about. I think he probably feels burned by the Pence pick as like, I listened to the consultants and this time I'm going to trust my gut. And my gut just says put someone on TV who looks good on TV. If Sarah Palin, 2008, wandered into the room right now, Trump would pick her in an instant.
In a second.
In a second. I mean, it's like kind of amazing that he would just like completely make that same pick.
Kristi Noem is the fill-in for Sarah Palin 2008.
I think that's right. And I think there's a good chance there. But anyway, we will leave it there with our Veepstakes week. This has been really fun. We've learned some lessons, hopefully helped you kind of get your head around the rhythms of an election year. And again, we will be doing more of these as we go. I think our next one is going to be looking at getting into the conventions, maybe some political advertising, and then come fall, we will obviously be talking about debates and October surprises and all sorts of things. But we leave it there with Veepstakes week. Thanks for listening, and thanks, as always, Nicole Hammer.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson. Thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.